I told myself it was just dinner, a polite evening to meet the people who would officially become family. In practice, it was a test run for their assumptions, a rehearsed display where their scripts would meet my silence. My name is Isabella Cruz. I had built my company from the ground up: tech platforms, 2 rounds of funding, a reputation for making hard choices with soft language. So when Mateo, my fiancé, told me his parents were flying in for a formal dinner at Le Sable, the newest glass-walled restaurant on the riverfront, I said yes, because part of love is showing up to the things the other person thinks matter. The restaurant was the kind of place that feels like an exhibit. Low lights, a pianist who plays without inflection, waiters who move like choreography. Mateo greeted me at the valet with a smile that made his eyes nervous in a way I had learned to read. "It's important to them," he murmured as we crossed the lobby. I wore a simple black dress and a jacket that cost less than a single entree on the tasting menu. Sometimes understatement is the knife that cuts deepest. They sat us at a round table with a view of the river, every place setting perfectly aligned, a single white rose at the center like a banked ember. His fiancée, Elena Marlowe, arrived with her parents in an entourage of curated manners. Her father in a gray suit that could have been pressed on a production line, her mother with a smile that looked practiced in mirrors. They exchanged airlight compliments. We ordered wine that tasted of oak and intent. For the first 20 minutes, they spoke to Mateo with the warmth of those who assume shared language carries meaning. They spoke to me with a different syntax, not cruel but condescending. The soft cadence people use when they think someone comes from a place of service rather than power. "Isabella, Mr. Marlowe said at one point, his tone an oil slick of false friendliness. "Tell us about your charity work. How nice to see women who remember where they come from." The words were a hand that patted the air above me like an uneven measurement. I smiled. My smile is a careful thing, an instrument that keeps the room safe until the knife is out. I had heard versions of that sentence before, phrases glued to other people's privilege. They were not malicious in the theatrical way. They were confident, which is worse. Confidence makes contempt feel like measurement. Elena tucked her napkin like a signal and asked if I missed home now that I lived in my own apartment downtown. The questions were small parades. Where did you grow up? Who taught you to cook? Which school did you attend? I answered with the truth. A modest childhood, scholarships, late nights in co-working spaces. I told the story of my first angel investor, the woman who gave me $5,000 without asking for the interest of a title. I watched their faces map onto details they had not expected someone who raised capital, coded her first prototype, negotiated contracts. Their eyebrows tightened in private calculations. It's always the numbers that beat a stereotype. Mateo squeezed my hand under the table like an apology. I let him. The meal proceeded with that mechanical elegance. Restaurants practice, amuse-bouche, a pause for applause, wine decanted like offerings. At the risotto course, Mr. Marlowe lifted his glass and spoke in a voice that wanted to be conciliatory. "In our family," he said, "tradition is everything. We believe in lineage and continuity. People know their place, and they play it well." He paused and smiled the way people smile when they believe a world will bend to their calendar. Elena joined in with a little laugh that curdled like cream left out too long. I felt something open and cold inside me, the recognition that the table was not simply a meeting but a performance designed to measure my fit. It would have been easy to retreat into hurt or indignation. Instead, I sharpened my attention into instruments. If they wanted to talk in the language of pedigree and place, I would learn to speak it better and then translate back what they could not bear to hear. My opportunity came 2 courses later. The waiter presented a dessert menu printed on heavy paper and with a flourish mentioned a special and invitation-only wine pairing that the restaurant offered to private tables. Elena's father, who had been watching me with the proprietorial patience of someone inspecting a rug, asked if we had heard of the value of certain vintages from the Marlowe family cellar, a point calibrated to show he had more taste than the room. He spoke a phrase in a smooth, clipped tone, an idiom from their circle that signaled wealth, an inside word meaning true aristocrat. It was the wrong kind of flourish because he said it in English and then, half to himself, repeated it in a phrase that sounded like their mother tongue, the language of closed menus and private clubs. Matteo nodded politely, then turned to me and murmured, "They sometimes switch old habit." My ears pricked. Elena, with a knowing tilt, added something to the effect of, "It's childish, dear," and the room softened except for the small iron in my chest. I had been preparing for this, not for the casual insensitivity that is a given, but for the precise moment when they reveal how little they believe I belong. So I did something small, precise, and entirely public. I reached into my clutch, took out my phone, and tapped the restaurant's QR code to request the wine list. When the sommelier brought the iPad, I asked aloud in a voice like a bell, "Would you mind translating the phrase Mr. Marlowe used? I want to understand his reference." Heads turned, spoons paused mid-air. Mr. Marlowe's smile tightened. Elena's mother fluttered. For a second, Matteo's face looked like an actor caught mid-script. The sommelier, a man trained to be eyes and not comment, read the phrase and hesitated. Then, in an effort to be helpful, said the literal translation, and then, quietly, its cultural context. An old-world expression indicating ownership and exclusion, the sort of code families use to gatekeep. The table went slightly colder. I watched it happen with no drama. My voice was calm. Then I said, "How interesting. In my experience, true value is not the right to exclude. It's the responsibility to include." The sentence landed like a coin on the table. A waiter misstepped, and for a beat the restaurant hummed a little louder, the sound of uncertainty. Elena tried to laugh it off. Her father said, "I'm sure you meant something else." I had meant precisely what I said. Then, as dessert arrived, I asked the sommelier another small question about provenance, about whether the Marlowe vintage was independently audited or if it was a seller claim based on family lore. His answer was elegant. Provenance documents accompany anything above a certain value, and the restaurant requires third-party verification for any seller item presented as an offered pairing. Matteo's face, which had been wrapped in conciliatory lines, became a study in color as the sommelier produced, with an apologetic flourish, a tablet displaying images and documents. They included, yes, a scanned letter purportedly from the Marlowe estate, an unverifiable note, hand-signed and lacking modern traceability. The sommelier said, gently, that while family provenance is a beautiful story, the restaurant could not validate the claim without paperwork. The table shifted. Conversations that had been comfortable turned brittle. Mr. Marlowe tried to speak, a hand fluttering like an embarrassed bird, and Elena's eyes darted for support. Matteo reached across and squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back not to reassure him, but because pressure communicates more than words sometimes. It is a signal that I was present and not the silent ornament they had planned. The rest of the evening was a series of small reveals I orchestrated with the exacting patience of someone who edits a book, a casual mention of a charity audit I'd overseen, an offhand reference to a vendor list I controlled in Matteo's new project, a photograph on my phone showing a meeting I'd had that morning with a partner their social circle considered out of class. Each detail was a counterpoint that eroded the tidy assumptions at the head of the table. By the end of the meal, the mood had changed from polished acceptance to a thin curiosity edged with discomfort. When we walked out, Elena's mother pressed a hand to her own chest in the old theatrical gesture of shock and whispered something in their private tongue. But walking away, the river behind us, I felt something else entirely, an absence where their certainty had been. This was not a public humiliation staged for applause, it was a recalibration. I had spoken their language back to them, not in mimicry, but in translation. And in doing so I had shown the room what their script looked like from the outside. Matteo asked, voice small, if I'd gone too far. I looked at him and said, simply, I spoke truth. He didn't argue. The stake at our table had always been who we believed ourselves to be. Tonight I learned that some people prefer the theater of lineage to the work of partnership. That's useful to know. I also learned something else. When privilege speaks in code, the best revenge is fluency. After that dinner, the world didn't explode. It rearranged itself in small, telling ways. The Marlowes retreated into the safety of their assumptions, whispered comments at the club, a few frostier calls from mutual friends, but their little coronation had cracked, and cracks propagate. I went home that night with the river in my ears and an inventory of moments catalogued like evidence. Phrases, faces, the sommelier's careful validation, the way Matteo flinched when his browned. Father's tone shifted. The next morning, I set about quietly converting embarrassment into leverage, the way I'd always converted risk into runway, methodically, without drama. First, I organized the facts. I printed the restaurant's provenance policy, the sommelier's notes, and the email chain that confirmed the Marlowe seller note was nothing more than a sentimental PDF kept in a private folder. Then I checked my own records. Contracts I'd signed for Matteo's startup advisory work, partnership outlines that listed my contributions in the margins, a calendar full of meetings where I'd been the one to broker introductions. It was all small and legal and honest. Evidence, when assembled, has a gravity of its own. I called my lawyer, Denise, and told her plainly what had happened. Not for court yet, I said, for leverage. She understood. You make them uncomfortable in private, she said. You make them accountability in public. I smiled. She had taken my strategy language and turned it into law. For the next week, I moved through two worlds, the visible one where smiles smoothed edges and business went on, and the invisible one where I laid a mesh of guardrails. I began with small practicalities. I asked our mutual PR contact for a professional write-up of my work, neutral phrasing, verifiable metrics, nothing theatrical. I asked for copies of invoices and vendor lists from the catering company that handled the dinner. They sent them the same day. I drafted concise emails to investors and partners I knew were on the periphery, people who listened when results mattered more than pedigree. The message was mundane, a heads up that I'd be overseeing certain aspects of Matteo's new project and would be glad to coordinate introductions. Nothing inflammatory, everything anchor. While I did this, I also watched Matteo. He apologized in a way that felt like a rehearsal, stammered, halting, the sort of apology that asks for God, absolution without altering behavior. I didn't expect them to, he began, voice small. It's not about that, I said. It's about what you let them assume. He looked at me like someone learning a new language and said, I love you. I said, I know you do. I need to see that reflected in how you behave. He promised to call his father. He promised to set boundaries. Then he went to work. Promises are paper until they're audited. Over the next month, I pushed the quiet levers that reveal character. I asked for receipts from events Matteo had billed to the advisory firm and found a thin seam of guest lists that credited the Marlowe family's charity as host for a dinner that lacked documentation. I requested, politely, that certain introductions credited to family connections be clarified in writing for investor records. A few replies came back with vague phrasing that read like a protective shell. It was small stuff, administrative, the kind of tidy inquiry most people ignore when they prefer the warmth of a compliment. But I didn't ignore it. I was building a pattern, little corrections that, when connected, would show a tendency to leverage relationships as currency rather than partnerships built on equal work. Social currency is stealthy power. Exposing it requires patience. Meanwhile, rumors widened like cracks in a plaster wall. The Marlowes stopped inviting us to their charity weekends. A dinner with their circle was postponed with a tasteful text about schedules. Matteo's calls home came shorter and colder. He complained less about his father's tone and more about the weight of inherited expectation, the slow press that made him feel inadequate in private and performative in public. I listened, and then I acted. My next move was public and elegantly simple. I launched a small initiative through my company, a scholarship program for women in underserved communities to learn product design and entrepreneurship. It was earnest, data-driven, and carefully documented. We partnered with community colleges, set measurable goals, and published the terms online. The Marlowes, who loved to parade generosity, had always favored theatrical giving gala dinners with speeches and lots of name plaques. My program was quiet and accountable. Within a week of the announcement, a mutual friend sent a thin note. "They're curious. Why not invite Mr. Marlowe to endorse?" I replied with the same calm I'd used at the table. "This is not a branding opportunity, it's a pipeline. If he wishes to contribute, the donation process and reporting guidelines are posted publicly." The friend's reply, a single emoji and nothing else, was the kind of dismissal that says more than speech. My program's public transparency was a scalpel. It required traceable money, proof, and accountability. You can't perform oversight with a family legend and a seller note. You have to produce audited receipts. The effect was subtle but cumulative. The Marlowes' invitations dwindled, not because I'd insulted them publicly, but because the terrain of giving I'd created required evidence they didn't prefer to show. While the social shift settled, I tightened the legal net. Denise filed a small, innocuous motion that required limited disclosure of outside influence on investor introductions for certain advisory roles. Language benign enough to pass as governance, but potent enough to require documentation from anyone who'd used family ties as leverage. The motion was procedural and reasonable. I expected no pushback. The pushback came from the Marlowes, not in villainous tantrums but in petty administrative friction. Delayed replies, a curt secretary, a guarded tone in the letters that once flowed like courtesy. My satisfaction wasn't mean. It was architectural. I'd turned their assumptions into paperwork they couldn't circumvent without risk. In the quieter hours, I found allies, people who had once been politely excluded from elite circles and now saw in my moves a corridor to belonging. A boutique investor who'd been passed over for invitations called to say quietly, "You did it the right way. No spectacle. Just accountability." The tone in his voice was one I'd waited to hear. Respect that was not given for bloodlines but earned for competence. The elephant in the room. Matteo's choice loomed, and one evening he came to me with a stack of paper, a letter he had drafted to his father, setting boundaries, a plan for the company that put my role into formal recognition, and a promise to attend family therapy. He looked tired, relieved, hopeful. "I don't want your life to be about proving what you already are," he said. "I want to act like the man who matches what you do." I believed him, the way you believe someone who has finally cataloged their errors. But belief without structure is a risk, so I asked for concrete steps. A. Public note on the advisory role, written confirmation of who handled introductions, and a timeline for the family to match words with deeds. He agreed. As the weeks unfolded, the Marlowes' social power dimmed in places that mattered: investor introductions, club memberships, and private endorsements, because their pattern of performative privilege had been documented and rendered impractical. People prefer certainty to theater. I didn't make them victims. I made a system inconvenient for performative exclusion. In the end, the revenge was not a spectacle. It was a recalibration of who gets credibility in rooms where money and influence live. I watched as invitations returned, recalibrated and sincere, and as Matteo began to move with the steadiness of someone who had learned to align actions with words. He took responsibility in small and public ways, and his father, seeing the floor shift under him, softened, or at least learned to measure his tone. The Marlowes never thanked me. They never apologized. They tightened the family circle and retreated to rituals that no longer affected our lives. That was the point. Revenge, for me, was not the collapse of a dynasty but the rearrangement of the map so that old gates no longer barred new pathways. By the third month, I had stopped thinking of it as revenge. It was simply balance correcting itself. The Marlowes had built their influence on performance theater seats filled with people who never questioned the script. All I did was turn on the lights. The dinner had been my first glimpse behind the curtain. Now I wanted the world to see what stood there too. Matteo's company was entering a new funding round, and I was quietly leading a separate project, an expansion of my design firm into hospitality tech. Clean systems, traceable operations, measurable results. My kind of empire. We shared some investors, and that overlap gave me the leverage I needed. Every investor report I sent was data-rich and emotionally neutral, but each line carried subtext: accountability, transparency, inclusivity, the very things the Marlows had never learned to practice. Meanwhile, their family foundation stumbled under the weight of its own opacity. A journalist I'd met months earlier, someone who admired my transparency initiative, reached out one morning. "Can I quote you about ethical philanthropy?" she asked. I said yes. The article ran 2 weeks later under the headline, "Old Money Meets New Ethics: How the Next Generation is Rewriting Charity." My quotes were calm, professional, pointed. The Marlows' name appeared twice in the background context, once for tradition, once for contrast. That's the thing about subtle truth. You don't have to name the guilty. Their reflection betrays them. I didn't send the article to Matteo. He saw it himself. I could tell, because he started working longer hours, attending investor meetings with a posture that looked more like partnership than apology. I had told him once that character isn't what you claim, it's what remains after you're exposed. Maybe he'd started believing that too, but his father wasn't finished. A month after the article, the Marlowe patriarch hosted an exclusive charity auction to reassert the family's grace. Invitations went to every name that still mattered in their circle. One went to me too, addressed to Isabella Cruz Marlowe, an identity I hadn't accepted yet. The card was thick and gold foiled, the kind of gesture meant to impress. I smiled when I saw it because arrogance always announces itself. I went. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, champagne, and whispered hierarchies. Elena was there too, no longer Matteo's ex, but a ghostly fixture at her parents' side. She looked at me once, then looked away, a reflex of privilege unlearning itself. The event unfolded like any other performance: speeches, bidding, applause. The Marlows presented an exclusive art donation, claiming it as a centuries-old heirloom meant to fund a cultural scholarship. It was familiar theater gesture over verification, but this time, verification mattered. Because my company's system had quietly been adopted by the charity's digital platform after my earlier work, every donation now required traceable digital authentication. When the auctioneer unveiled the painting, a faded portrait allegedly from a private European estate, the new platform automatically generated its public data summary on the event's live screen. The provenance check flickered. The data came back empty. The system requested verification documents. A hush swept the room. Mr. Marlowe, still smiling but visibly tense, whispered to the coordinator. The coordinator tapped furiously at the screen, then looked at me. "Miss Cruz, could you?" I walked to the stage like I'd been waiting for that cue all my life. "Of course," I said. The verification tool requires only one: proof of authenticity. If the paperwork exists, we'll upload it. My voice was soft, but it carried. The crowd leaned in. The pianist stopped mid-song. The screen blinked again. Item authenticity pending. A collective inhale followed. Mr. Marlowe's composure cracked just enough for the lights to catch it. It wasn't public humiliation, it was administrative exposure. The system I'd built didn't care about surnames or social decorum, it cared about proof. The charity board members glanced around, whispering. I tapped the mic gently and said, "Transparency doesn't diminish legacy. It protects it." The room went quiet, polite, and then broke into scattered applause, not loud, but enough. The painting was discreetly withdrawn. The Marlows left before dessert. Matteo found me near the exit, eyes wide with shock, and something else, relief maybe. "You planned this," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No, I built it. They planned their own exposure." The article that followed the next morning wasn't cruel. "Accountability tools expose gaps in heritage auctions," read the headline. My name appeared once, my company twice, and the Marlows were reduced to background noise. The calls I received that week weren't gossip, they were business. Partners who'd ignored me months ago wanted collaboration. Investors wanted meetings. The scholarship fund's applications doubled. Revenge wasn't supposed to feel like progress, but sometimes justice wears success as its disguise. A few nights later, Matteo came over, his face lined with both admiration and fatigue. "My father's furious," he said. He called you ruthless. I laughed softly. That's fine. His generation called every woman ruthless who refused to be silent. Matteo exhaled, then asked the question I'd been expecting. Do we still have a future? I looked at him for a long moment, weighing the difference between affection and partnership. That depends, I said finally. Do you want to build something with me or rebuild what they broke? He nodded slowly. With you, he said. But I have to earn that. He was right. Love, like business, demands proof. By morning, I'd already drafted a quiet restructuring proposal that would formally separate our ventures and secure my holdings. Matteo signed without protest. The Marlowes made no public statement, but the silence around them grew loud. Invitations slowed, charity boards hesitated. It wasn't ruin, it was recognition. The same people who once bowed to their wealth now measured worth by something else. Transparency, verifiable impact, modern ethics. I had rewritten the rules without needing to say their names. That was my strategy all along. Let them think the battle was personal while I built a system that made their world obsolete. Revenge doesn't have to burn, it can evolve, and when it does, it doesn't leave ashes. It leaves a better map. The morning the Marlowe empire quietly collapsed wasn't explosive, it was clinical. I was sitting in my office overlooking the city, coffee cooling beside a stack of contracts, when the first notification pinged. A major investor had pulled out of their foundation, citing verification discrepancies. A second followed from a museum partner, pending documentation request. By the time the third message arrived, an official inquiry from the Heritage Grant Board, I knew it was done. The machine I'd built, the very system they mocked as bureaucratic, had done exactly what it was designed to do: expose false structure. I didn't gloat. I forwarded the alerts to Denise, my lawyer, and opened my calendar. My day was full calls, approvals, planning meetings, the kind of normal that feels like victory because it's built on your own terms. By noon, the Marlowes had gone into damage control. Their PR firm released a statement about transitional audits and data inconsistencies. In plain English, it meant they'd been caught. Matteo called, voice low. They're panicking, he said. My father thinks you orchestrated this. I looked out the window at the skyline glittering like possibility. He's half right, I said. I just built the truth and let it work. He hesitated. They've lost millions, I answered. Then maybe they'll learn the cost of dismissing someone who refused to stay small. Later that week, I walked into a charity gala, my gala, not theirs. The event raised funds for young entrepreneurs who came from places like mine, people the Marlowes would have never invited to their tables. Every face there represented proof that access beats inheritance. As I stood at the podium, cameras flashing, I thought of that dinner months ago, the table, the tone, the coded words. How easily they had underestimated me. For years, I said to the crowd, I was told legacy was something you inherit, but I've learned legacy is something you build when the world doesn't think you can. Applause rose, warm and unforced. I smiled, not out of triumph, but clarity. The old order was gone, and I hadn't needed to shout to dismantle it. The next morning, headlines rippled across business feeds. Old Wealth Foundation under investigation for fraudulent provenance claims. Transparency Tech by Cruise Systems reshapes philanthropy. My name appeared beside phrases like innovation, integrity, vision. The Marlowes' name appeared beside mismanagement. Matteo texted once, I'm sorry for what they said at that dinner. I replied with a single line, I've already translated it into something better. 2 months later, I visited the same restaurant where it all began. The pianist was still there. The chandeliers still gleamed. I sat at the same table, ordered the same wine, and watched the river move beneath the glass walls. This time, there was no performance, no coded language, no subtle tests. Just peace. The waiter recognized me from news features and smiled. Miss Cruz, he said, an honor to have you back. I nodded, lifting my glass. Thank you, I said, and thank the systems that work. As I left, I passed the corner table where the Marlowes had once sat with all their certainty. Now it was empty, cleared for new guests. Outside, the night air was soft, the city alive with noise and movement. I paused at the river's edge and looked at my reflection in the glass, calm, steady, defined not by lineage but by proof. Revenge, I realized, was never about destruction. It was about translation, turning their language of exclusion into my blueprint for power. They had wanted to speak in codes. I rewrote the code itself. They had wanted me small. I became the system that measured them. And as the lights shimmered on the water and the last of their influence dissolved into the current, I whispered what I'd end. Waited all this time to say, I understand you now, but you'll never understand me. Then I walked away, not as the woman who was tested at a table, but as the architect of an empire that no one could ever talk over again.